Hello all, and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another deeper dive into the archive. As the title says, today I'm looking at the Kapok Tree Inn that used to be a restaurant in Clearwater, close to the top end of Tampa Bay. I don't usually talk about restaurants, even though they're obviously part of Florida's tourism history. Nearly every restaurant in Florida isn't significant enough to cover, considering all the other stories I've shared and will share. But the Kapok Tree Inn was different. It's very easy to overuse the terms iconic and unique, but this place easily earned both distinctions. While it was a successful restaurant, it was significantly more than that, as you'll soon see. One bit of evidence of its importance is represented by this plate. In 1971, the National Arborist Association recognized Clearwater's Kapok Tree as a tree of distinction. There's a plaque next to the tree, and the restaurant used to sell these plates. I rarely go for memorabilia from Florida attractions. As you can see behind me, I don't have a lot of items directly from attractions. But this is one plate I'm very happy to have. Ironically, unlike the Kapok Tree restaurant itself, it's rather understated. The restaurant was a fixture in Clearwater from 1957 to 1991. It began operation in the midst of Florida's golden age of tourism. However, the location had been an attraction long before the restaurant ever fried its first chicken leg. It was the site of a popular orange grove and fruit stand, also named after the eponymous Kapok Tree and owned by a Robert Hoyt. The property was sold to Richard and Ethel Baumgardner of Urbana, Maryland in the mid-1950s. They built the first part of the restaurant in 1957. The Baumgardners knew what they were doing since they were already the successful owners of the Peter Pan Inn near Urbana. They saw Clearwater as a place to open another restaurant after wintering there for several years. In its 33 years of operation, the Kapok Tree grew from one building to a large complex of interconnected buildings. The additional construction took place between 1959 and 1985. By every measure, it was a highly successful restaurant and attraction which drew visitors from all over the state and the country. It was one of the most popular attractions in the Tampa Bay area, serving up to 5,000 people a day. At least that's what the Kapok Tree's promotional staff stated. A lower number of 1,700 patrons has also been suggested by local press, but that's the seating capacity of the entire facility. The restaurant said it served about 1 million meals a year. An estimate is that somewhere close to 25 million guests were served in the 33 years. The design of the Kapok Tree Inn was as remarkable as its statistics. Eventually, the structure measured about 125,000 square feet or 12,000 square meters. That would be roughly the area of 2 American football fields, and the entire place was lavishly decorated. While some critics described it as unsophisticated, garish, kitschy, vulgar, or tasteless, many people were fans. The design was emphatically over the top, but that's been an element of Florida style for well over 100 years. Here's the Villa Zareta in St. Augustine, built in 1883. Its design was inspired by the Alhambra Palace in Granada, Spain. This 140-year-old home, now museum, is considered the earliest example of fantasy architecture in Florida. The Kapok Tree continued that tradition by creating a space that provided a remarkable experience for all who visited it. It was filled with classical Greek elements, usually interpreted through the Baroque art style of the 17th and 18th centuries. That style used contrast, movement, exuberant detail, saturated color, grandeur, and surprise to imbue a sense of awe in the viewer. The Kapok Tree combined this dramatic design with an overflowing amount of greenery: fern, grape, hibiscus, palm, citrus, ivy, bougainvillea, and philodendron. Parts of the indoors looked more like gardens, while other rooms were formal with classically themed paintings, tiled floors, massive chandeliers, and rich paneling. Let's take a quick look at the timeline of the Kapok Tree before moving on to a tour of the facility. Robert Hoyt bought the property in the late 1800s, and he both lived on the land and operated an orange grove there. It's believed that in 1888 he planted a kapok tree sapling in front of his home near what would become McMullen Booth Road, east of Clearwater. This was before Clearwater would incorporate in 1891. While it's unclear where Hoyt got the sapling, it might have been from an importer in the Keys, as other kapoks would eventually be planted there. Growing rapidly in their native India, the tree can grow as much as 13 feet or 4 meters a year when young, and it didn't take long before the tree was large enough to become a landmark. There are reports of people visiting it in the early 20th century. The original property was about 50 acres or 20 hectares in size. It was later sold to a Sumner Covey, who continued to operate the grove and fruit stand. These postcards show that the tree is about the same size and dimensions as it is today, which means it took maybe 60 years to reach more than 100 feet or 30 meters in height. The tree is set back from the road, and there's a fruit stand in the foreground. The noteworthy tree helped increase the fruit stand's sales, and it'd be the main reason why Richard and Ethel Baumgardner bought the property. As I mentioned, they owned the Peter Pan Inn restaurant in Maryland. That restaurant was opened in 1926 by Grace Baumgardner, Richard's mom, in a 19th century farmhouse in Urbana. After Grace's untimely death in 1945, Richard overhauled the entire establishment and added antiques and knickknacks to the 5 dining rooms, creating a unique dining experience for families looking for a family-style dinner. After purchasing the property in Clearwater, the Baumgardners took out a number of orange trees, built the first of 6 buildings, and opened in 1957. It was successful from the start. Richard's goal was to create a larger restaurant than the Peter Pan, with custom-designed buildings and similarly unusual and alluring atmosphere. It was obvious that it would be named the Kapok Tree Inn, considering that at the start the massive tree was the restaurant's biggest draw. In 1964, Ethel died suddenly at the age of 50. At the time, Ethel and Richard were in the middle of a divorce. 2 months later, Richard would marry June Ader, a Kapok Tree waitress who at the age of 33 was 22 years younger than her bridegroom. 4 years later, Richard and June would open Baumgardner's, a formal restaurant, across the street from the Kapok Tree Inn. The company went public in 1970 and opened other Kapok Tree restaurants in nearby Madeira Beach as well as Fort Lauderdale. Richard died at the age of 68 in 1976, the same year the Kapok Tree was named one of the top 100 restaurants in the United States by Sales and Marketing Management magazine. After her husband's death, June donated 38 of the original 50 acres of land to the city of Clearwater with the provision that it be used for a performing arts venue. It's known as the Richard Baumgardner Center for the Performing Arts. Later, drugstore magnate Jack Eckerd bought the naming rights for the theater and used it to honor his wife, Ruth, hence the famous Ruth Eckerd Hall. June ended up in a legal battle with Richard's children over the restaurant empire, which grew in 1978 to include the short-lived Daytona Beach Kapok Tree Inn. That restaurant struggled and was closed 3 years later. As a result of the long court battle, June's majority shares were sold in 1984 to Houston businessman Murray Steinfeld. Steinfeld brought on board Aaron Fodeman as partner and manager of the restaurant. He had the menu modernized and service restructured. Across the street, Baumgardner's would be renamed the Savoy Dinner Club, but larger changes were on the horizon. Murray Steinfeld, who was heavily involved in real estate in Texas, died in 1988. He'd borrowed $5 million using the Kapok Tree as collateral, and when it wasn't possible to repay the loan, the property was seized. The Madeira Beach and Fort Lauderdale properties were sold off, and the Savoy Dinner Club was sold to the state. That building was subsequently demolished to widen McMullen Booth Road. Kapok Tree entered into bankruptcy, but kept on operating. Then on May 14, 1991, it closed without warning or explanation, leaving roughly 300 employees without jobs and faithful diners shocked. With a seemingly random decision at lunchtime on a Tuesday, people drove into the parking lot and left with puzzled looks on their faces. Driving by the front door, they asked if the closed sign beside the road was somehow a joke. Between 1988 and 1991, the modernized Kapok Tree had remained successful. A judge had even dismissed a bankruptcy case. It was a profitable business, ironically one of the few Golden Age Florida attractions to not only survive the arrival of Walt Disney World, but to expand and stay popular. In 1992, the property would be sold for $1.3 million to Elliot Rubinson, owner of Thoroughbred Music, with stores in Tampa and Sarasota. Elliot and his wife Pamela turned the largest part of the building into a third music store, and in 1999 they leased it to Sam Ash, a family-owned chain of musical instrument stores. Sam Ash is still open and has a friendly and understanding staff when it comes to people just coming in to look at the building. As you can see, parts of the original decorations, including various sculptures, remain to make the place one of the more unusual instrument stores in the world. Elliot Rubinson died in 2017, while Pamela continues to own the property as well as Kapok Special Events Center and Gardens, a business located in the rest of the building. It's a venue for many events, including weddings, anniversaries, reunions, and concerts, and has kept the many different rooms and gardens in excellent condition. The term kapok comes from the Malay language and refers to a species native to South and Southeast Asia. Known as Bombax ceiba, it's popular throughout its natural habitat and is generally known as the red cotton tree in many languages. That name refers to the cup-shaped red flowers and the cotton-like white fibers that fill the seed pods. Kapok can grow up to 200 feet or 61 meters in height. The trunk and limbs are covered in conical spines to protect the tree, but they get eroded after the many years. The flowers are heavy and measure up to 5 inches or 12 centimeters across. The petals feel like a thin banana peel. The size of the flowers and the sheer number of them create a dramatic sight during early spring. The effect is especially pronounced because the tree drops its leaves just before it blooms. The seed pods are long and oval in shape and green when immature and turn brown or gray when ripe. They're filled with the white fiber, and like cotton bolls, the kapok seeds are mixed in with the white fibers. Also like cotton, the pods will burst open to release the fibers and seeds. The fibers are spun into thread and woven into fabric or are used as stuffing in pillows. People eat the cores of the flowers as well as the immature flower buds, and the petals can be used to make tea. The flowers are pollinated by bees, and crab spiders hide in the flowers to catch the bees. The state's most famous representative of the species was known as Florida's largest bouquet, and in Kapok Tree Inn literature it's described as having a 170-foot or possibly up to 200-foot spread. That'd be about 52 to 61 meters, but today it's about 150 feet or 46 meters across. It probably has been trimmed since it doesn't reach over the road, which is now closer than it was years ago. It's said that the circumference of the base was 52 feet or 16 meters. That looks about right, and I'd give it about a diameter of 16.5 feet or 5 meters. While the building is large, it's hard to call it imposing. The columns along the west side of the building were unusual. In Florida, the only large buildings with such columns would be places such as courthouses, city halls, and banks, as the neoclassical architecture movement, begun in the 1700s, was employed for more conservative structures. That's why many of the monuments in Washington, D.C. look like Greek and Roman temples. The neoclassical movement was partly a reaction to the overly ornate Baroque and Rococo movements. The irony is that while the exterior of the kapok tree is reserved, what lies within is comparatively surprising to visitors. Even the garden along the road was fairly conservative, with the focal point being the kapok. The one element of the building's exterior that stands apart is the relief pattern on the walls. It's not really noticeable until you get close, but then details emerge. It's a design featuring medieval human figures. A man blowing a hunting horn who is accompanied by a dog, a crossbow archer, a noble holding a bird by the legs, and a lady in robes next to a peacock with flowing tail feathers. Originally the figures were colored, though most of them have faded, and the only place where color can still be seen is under the entrance porch, which is protected from sunlight and rain. Lined with waiting rooms, lounges, and unusual gift shops, the entrance mall was filled with European statuary and many bubbling fountains. It was meant to be reminiscent of the grand shopping arcade of the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II in Milan, Italy. At about 100 feet wide and 270 feet long, it's the largest part of the complex at roughly 27,000 square feet, with 2 stories and a height of 22 feet, not counting its vaulted ceiling. The ceiling itself is 190 feet long and 40 feet wide and makes the total height of the entrance mall over 30 feet. At the north end is an enchanting statue of a child on a swan. The child, known in Italy as a puto, was originally limited to profane infatuations in pre-Christian times, though it would come to represent the sacred cherub who attended God. The swan symbolizes love and beauty and was sacred to the Roman goddess Venus. By the Baroque period in the 1600s, the puto represented the omnipresence of God, which rather confuses the point as to why God is writing a symbol of love. The mall is lined with impressive columns which support the balconies and ceiling. These Corinthian columns are from the last developed order of the 3 orders of ancient Greek architecture. They're set throughout the complex, on the exterior, in the gardens, and in 4 of the main rooms. The order is named for the Greek city-state of Corinth. Its earliest use can be traced back to the late classical period around 430 to 323 BCE, developing after the Doric and Ionic orders. The capital of a Corinthian column contains 2 ranks of stylized acanthus leaves and stalks. This order is known to have slender columns and the most richly decorated capitals. As guests headed further into the Kapok Tree and explored each of the lounges, dining rooms, and bars, it might have seemed as if the rich and dramatic views were lacking any cohesive theme, but that's not exactly true. That all of the columns are Corinthian is just one of the several common threads which unified the different tableaux. Others included having chandeliers as spectacular centerpieces to many of the rooms, which drew attention to either artwork positioned high on the walls or the Florida sunlight streaming through the many skylights. There are also a rich collection of plants, many of which were real and most of which were tropical. Likewise, the seats at the tables were metal scroll-back chairs typically, with different designs in the various rooms. There were also curious and quirky artifacts that represented each room's particular theme, so that in every room people could see interesting things, including a traditional canoe hanging from the ceiling, Greek and Roman-inspired statues, and hand-blown glass lamps, which provided atmospheric lighting. At the opposite end of the entrance mall sits the gilded circular ticket booth topped with a latticed dome. The statue adorning the top of the cage appears to be that of Galatea, the name from Greek mythology that's given to the statue carved by Pygmalion of Cyprus. Galatea, whose name means she who is milk white, was carved so perfectly from ivory that Pygmalion fell in love with the statue. He later made a wish to the goddess Aphrodite for a bride who would be the living likeness of his ivory girl. Eventually, the goddess of love granted his wish and turned Galatea from ivory to flesh. The ticket booth is lit by the only chandelier in this area. It's adorned with thousands of glass beads and is located inside the booth. The upper part of the exterior has a frieze of white anemone flowers, which are sacred to the goddess Aphrodite, as they were thought to have been created from Aphrodite's tears and the blood of her lover Adonis after he was gored by a boar. The gift shops located on both sides of the entrance mall featured unusual items from Florida and all over the world and reflected the charm of the Kapok Tree. There was a little bit of everything from china, glassware, statues, jewelry, soaps, candy, and of course souvenir booklets and postcards. The gallery room housed many European art treasures, the foremost of which was the remarkable French wall paneling and flanking columns. On the walls were paintings dating as early as the 14th century. The impressive wood entrance doors were hand-carved and part of a 13th century Flemish building. One of the most dramatic chandeliers hung in the center, a red metal frame that had candles on top, lights below, and a crystal domed light fixture on the bottom. The crystal hall is accented by more columns and Italian crystal chandeliers. On both sides of the central vaulted ceiling were hand-tinted mural prints depicting each month of the year. Sunlight streamed into the long hall through skylights as well as a wall of west-facing windows. The Red Lounge contained love seats, made up of 30 antique French seat frames built before 1900 and never finished. They were shipped to the U.S. and upholstered in Clearwater with lush red velvet. The dramatic red and white wall paneling featured reproductions of Italian prints made around the year 1600. Originally an outdoor space, the patio room was decorated with dozens of hand-blown glass Italian light fixtures and a canopy of bougainvillea. The large plant would bloom between fall and spring, providing a breathtaking canopy of color. The Zebra Bar and Lounge were dominated by a floating, authentic outrigger canoe imported from Panama. Haitian masks and drums complemented a hand-painted mural on the walls. The floor and the director's chairs were covered with zebra print fabric, and the tables were crafted from white marble. The main feature of the chandelier room was not surprisingly this chandelier. While the magnificent piece of art was designed and built at the Kapok Tree, it was composed of beads and crystals originally from New York City's Paramount Theater. The crystal was restrung on a frame that was also made in Clearwater. The room included candlelight and a bubbling fountain. The marble statue in the room was originally one of a group designed to depict the 4 continents of the world. This one, imported from a Scottish castle, represented America. The grape bar was interesting and colorful, displaying a viniculture motif in decorative grillwork, wrought iron bar stools, and antique Czechoslovakian grape cluster lights. The atmosphere was reminiscent of the cooling shade beneath an arbor surrounded by living plants. The adjacent Emerald Lounge was one of 3 cocktail lounges and contained translucent emerald green stained glass windows that bathed the room in a verdant light. The Florida room was the second largest dining room and was designed to create the feeling of a monumental arbor that supported tropical foliage. At one end was a wall of cascading fountains. 32 statues, figures known as caryatids, supported the fountain and wishing well. Caryatids are an ancient Greek female figure that would take the place of a column. They represent the maidens of Caryae, a town on the Greek Peloponnese. The town had a temple dedicated to the goddess Artemis, and the main statue in the room is Artemis, with her hunting dog. She is the goddess of the hunt. The wishing well was cast at the Kapok Tree from an iron mold created in 1820. The original iron statue acted as a radiator on a wooden stove. The room's chandeliers originally decorated the Italian embassy in Washington, D.C. The grand ballroom overlooking the south garden and pond was graced by yet another crystal chandelier. The 2-story room featured a Florentine-inspired marble floor, intricate grillwork, and hand-painted ceiling. The staircase had a gilded ornament balustrade, and the elaborately embellished carvings in the balcony were cast from 18th century woodwork found in the Medici Palace in Florence. The balcony and mural were illuminated by a handmade dome. Sometimes known as the West Garden, it's the one with the tree. The trunk was ringed by a metal scroll-work fence and yet more Corinthian columns. There was a fountain and more statuary as well. Much of this garden is gone today. What's left are statues in the fountain, which has seen better days. Most of the Kapok Tree statues were made in Clearwater and were inspired by works of art by the masters that the Baumgartners saw in Europe. Stone carvings were carved by Morselletto from Vicenza, Italy, whose grandfather built the DuPont mansion in Delaware. Around the pond in the South Garden were towering caryatid statues which shared the undergrowth with deer statues. Artisans such as painters, glassblowers, and sculptors often worked in the gardens, adding to the rich ambiance. While this garden is sometimes divided into two, the north and the east, it's all connected. The northern side was inspired by the Roman Villa d'Este, and the arches by Hadrian's villa. The garden presented a spectacular panorama of lights and cascading water highlighted by flame-crowned columns. About 60,000 gallons of water flowed through the fountains every hour. One of the statues was from Germany and dates to the 18th century. It represents the three Graces. In Greek mythology, the Charities or Graces were three or more goddesses of charm, beauty, nature, goodwill, and fertility. The Greek poet Hesiod named three: Aglaia, meaning shining; Euphrosyne, meaning joy; and Thalia, meaning blooming. The Graces were the daughters of Zeus, and Eurynome, one of the daughters of the Titan Oceanus. Before the menu was modernized, the Kapok Tree was famous for good food served family style. That type of restaurant has largely disappeared today, but it was popular in the mid-20th century. Guests would order an entree at the ticket booth when first arriving and would be escorted to one of the 400 tables. There was a choice of 4 entrees: fried chicken or fried shrimp, a big slice of ham, or a T-bone steak. People could walk around for a while to explore or visit one of the bars or lounges, which served all manner of alcohol and soft drinks, though they specialized in the overly sweet cocktails so popular in the 50s and 60s. The signature drink was the Kapok Tree Planter's Punch that came with a souvenir glass, which are still commonly available on eBay, illustrating the drink's popularity. The original recipe is in the notes, but be forewarned, it calls for 3.5 ounces of rum, so it packs quite a punch. But back to the food. The entree was served to each guest. Note the red plastic marker sticking out of this family's T-bones, which signified the doneness of the steak. Yes, that used to be a thing. The rest of the food was put on platters to be passed around the table. The classic Kapok Tree meal included a relish tray with mounds of cottage cheese, sweet pickled veggies, coleslaw, and apple butter. The apple butter was particularly good on the fresh corn fritters. Note that these were not hush puppies. Southerners likely know the difference, but it's pretty simple. Hush puppies are deep-fried dollops of cornmeal batter. Fritters are made from wheat flour and whole kernels of corn. That Kapok recipe is in the notes as well. By the way, another use of the apple butter was to mix a bit into your cottage cheese. Try this sometime. You'll thank me. There were trays of roasted potatoes and cooked beets, plus there were peas, which at some point changed from being creamed to having a mushroom sauce on the top. If you're still hungry, you could ask for more of everything except the meat, but you could also just wait until the ice cream was served. As you can see, none of this is haute cuisine, but done well, it was tasty and certainly filling. Many guests benefited from a walk around the gardens after dinner. As a 1968 souvenir booklet states, about 1 million dinners per year meant the guests went through 100 tons of chicken, 50 tons of shrimp, 125 tons of T-bone, 20 tons of ham, 25 tons of cottage cheese, 40 tons of peas, 40 tons of coleslaw, 75 tons of potatoes, 2 million cups of coffee, and 30,000 gallons of ice cream. For perspective, the T-bones would come from nearly 9,000 head of cattle, while the chicken is equal to 40,000 individual 5-pound fryers. As I mentioned before, there were other restaurants owned by the Baumgartners, and I wanted to show them briefly. The first is, of course, Baumgartner's, the formal dining restaurant once located across the street. The building is gone, but from 1968 until '88, it was as popular as the Kapok Tree. While the food was upscale, the setting was basically the same. In fact, if you look around the internet, you'll see that people often mistake Baumgartner's rooms for the Kapok Tree rooms. Oddly enough, you'll see the same thing happening with the Kapok Tree Inns in Madeira Beach, Fort Lauderdale, and Daytona Beach. Every restaurant was similar but not identical, featuring Baroque elements, plants, and lots of details. I guess it's a bit odd to end a video by talking about the restaurant that started it all, but so it goes. This is the Peter Pan Inn. Like all of the other sites, it's no longer open, and sometimes after 2007, much of it was destroyed, as you can see from these Google images. And yes, the Peter Pan was undoubtedly the inspiration for the Kapok Tree. Whether you love or hate their sense of style, you've got to admit that over the years they were remarkably consistent in how they wanted their restaurants to look. I find myself saying this over and over in some of my videos. This was one of Florida's most remarkable and unique attractions. While the state has had thousands of restaurants that catered to tourists, a few of which have had significant legacies, the Kapok Tree was so much more than just a place to eat. Visitors could spend hours looking at 125,000 square feet of details, both those touching on the elegant as well as those that were less than sophisticated. Thank you for watching another of my videos. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to learn more about Florida's tourism history. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.